Welcome back to The Verdict. Mick Cornett with Kent Myers. Glad you're with us once again this week. We're here every week meeting interesting people and dealing with topical issues. And boy, you think after 475 shows, we would have exhausted just about every issue out there. But I'm glad you came up with this idea. It's very interesting to me.
Well, we thought last week we'd start a two-part series which deals with the practice of law in Oklahoma. And two ways to break it down, not the only two, but two ways to break it down is by a larger firm in a larger city on the one hand and a smaller firm or a sole practitioner in a smaller community, and try to contrast the two. And last week we had the show with that you were unable to attend with Roger Stong and Tom Wolf talking about practice in a larger firm. This week we're flipping it over to the rural setting and the smaller firm.
Look forward to it. And we're taking a look at law practice in a rural setting. It's today's topic on The Verdict. We'll be right back.
Natural gas is the gateway to a better world of energy. Instead of waiting, natural gas moves us forward now. Instead of finding ways to make dirty energy cleaner, natural gas simply is cleaner. We can use it to create our own energy, a wealth of new jobs, and keep more money here at home. Learn more at chk.com. Chesapeake, America's champion of natural gas.
Wilsey, Meyer, Eatman, Tate. We're accountants. We do taxes, business valuations, estate planning, and consulting. And we're right here in Oklahoma, working with the owners of small and medium-sized businesses. Steve Wilsey and Stuart Meyer have the resources and the experience. Wilsey, Meyer, Eatman, Tate in Oklahoma City and Tulsa.
Welcome back to The Verdict. Mick Cornett with Kent Myers, and Kent's going to introduce today's guests.
We're especially pleased today to have two folks that happen to be also friends of mine, and I really appreciate them giving us their time coming up from their communities to be with us. On my right is Phil Hurst, a fellow I've known since law school. Phil is a partner in the law firm of Hurst McNeil Gordon in Sulphur, Oklahoma. Did his undergraduate work at Oklahoma State University, was a very stellar graduate from the University of Oklahoma College of Law with honors. He practiced in Oklahoma City in a larger firm for 3 years and then moved in 1966 to Sulphur and has been practicing down there ever since. He has been a city council member. He represents the city as city attorney. He has been involved in many activities in Sulphur and the surrounding community. This is his first visit to The Verdict, and Phil, sure do appreciate you coming.
Thank you, Ken.
On my left is also a friend of mine, Trey Gray. Trey is did his undergraduate work at Oklahoma State University, did his law work at Oklahoma City University, where he did quite well, as a matter of fact. He's also, like Phil, a native Oklahoman. He began his law practice in 2006 after a very successful business career with Dell Computers. He practices law in Colgate, Oklahoma, and has his own office in Colgate. He represents the city of Colgate along with other business entities down there, as well as lots of landowners and people in the Colgate and southeast Oklahoma area. He's involved in activities that involve farming and ranching and hunting and fishing and anything else he can do to stay out of the office. But Trey, we appreciate you coming up from Colgate and joining us.
Thank you, Kent.
Phil, you started practicing over 40 years ago, which meant two things. First of all, you started as a small child. And secondly, you probably have some unique perspectives on being a small-town lawyer.
I always wanted to practice law in a small town. Keep in mind that I worked for about 4 years after I got out of undergraduate school, and I was in engineering. And it was obvious I couldn't determine where I was going to live. I was going to have to live where the work was. Came back to law school so that I could maybe determine where I
Saying an
live.
engineer couldn't necessarily get a job in a small town.
I think an engineer was starved to death in Sulphur. Yes, so I that's the reason. One of the reasons I came back to law school. Came back in 1960 and entered law school and finished and worked in Oklahoma City a while and knew that's not what I wanted to do. So I hooked up with an
I'm going to take that personally, by the way.
I understand. I hooked up with a classmate and an old friend, and he and I, Paul Reed Jr., began practicing law in Sulphur. And that's
So what's it like being a small town attorney? You see it depicted on in Hollywood stage and screen, and Atticus Finch comes forward every once in a while. But how do you do it?
Well, it's a trade-off, as most things are. If you want to practice in a small town, which not very many people do, honestly, you have to be prepared to give up a lot of material things. You can make more money in the large. Kent Myers is a perfect example of that. No question about that. The high-rise attorneys make the money. The small town attorneys, we do the same kind of practice, really, do the same kind of thing, except that we have walk-ins, we have people coming in almost every day into the office, and so it's a different kind of practice, but it's really the same thing.
Other than the fact that you probably don't deal with the large corporate from Sulphur, what are the differences? How would you say? What are the differences?
You represent a lot more people. People that are either landowners, farmers, ranchers, employees of companies, whatever. So you have a varied practice. I practice all kinds of law, criminal law, domestic. You cannot get away from domestic relations in small towns.
You can't specialize those. Is that what you're saying?
It's very, very difficult to specialize.
All right.
You better be prepared to realize that early in your practice.
Trey, let me ask you substantially the same question. You grew up in Ardmore and then lived in Dallas or lived in large cities in Texas working for Dell, and they were doing very well in the business world, decided to go back and get a law degree. And how did you gravitate to Colgate?
Actually, I had a client that from Ardmore who was doing a lot of business in Colgate during what we would, I guess, call the gas boom down there. And so went over to Colgate to help him. And in the process of being in Colgate, I met Clay Mowdy, who had been an attorney there for about 20 years. And I'd always heard that one of the best opportunities or ways to really learn quickly was to have an opportunity to go to work for somebody that had been in a small town practicing for a long time. Well, he had recently got elected to be the associate district judge. And so he and I kind of met, and he offered to basically sell me his practice. And it was just a really unique opportunity, and didn't really know anybody in Colgate, but that's kind of how I got there.
Well, how'd you get established? You moved in and went around and met people, I guess.
Well, Colgate is kind of, and I guess a lot of small towns are kind of this way. It's hard, I think, in the smaller communities to get doctors and lawyers a lot of times to want to live there. So the people were very, in my experience, very welcoming to have me there, and we had an open house and invited everybody, and of course ran ads in the paper for 6 months or so, and it didn't take a tremendous amount of time, I guess, to get established. The other thing, I remember the first time I ever appeared on a motion docket in Cole County. I was about 90 days out of law school, and I had a bunch of Mr. Mowdy's files to go appear on. Basically, most of his clients just agreed to let me to continue to represent him. And so I go down on a motion docket, and I've got 3 or 4 probates and a couple divorces and a couple criminal cases. And I had like 10 or 15 files, and so you learn quickly when you have to do it that way.
One thing I did not mention in your introduction, and I had intended to, and I apologize for leaving it out, but you've just been nominated by Governor Henry and confirmed by the Senate for a position on the Tourism Commission. I know you're just now getting started, but are you excited about doing that?
Yeah, I'm very excited about doing that. I spent, after I left OSU in '98, I lived in 9 cities in 6 years, everywhere from Dallas to Austin, Atlanta, Birmingham, Alabama. So I moved around a lot, and I've loved Oklahoma my whole life. I grew up spending a lot of time on Lake Murray, and my family and I enjoy going to Broken Bow Lake now. We go down there a lot. So this is a opportunity I think I'm really going to enjoy because I care a lot about the tourism and recreation, and I think that's a big asset for our state.
Well, it's quite a feather in your cap for as new as you are and relatively new in the practice of law, and in that community to be selected for that position. You're to be congratulated on that.
Well, thank you.
Let me ask you this, Phil. We have, of course, all experienced in the recession and some part of it. We had a show last week with two lawyers from larger firms talking about it and how it affected them. How has the recession affected your clients in your area?
That's a difficult question for me to answer. I think the clients are affected as anybody is during a recession. But as far as the law practice is concerned, I don't know if there's a whole lot I can tell about the recession that's adversely affected the practice of law in a small town. I think realistically, Oklahoma has not been hurt as bad in the recession as other states. I think we have to acknowledge that. The community I live in is an older population, but there's a lot of small industries that employ people as well as the state schools. There's the state deaf school. There's also the Veterans Hospital. So, to answer your question, I don't. We have to work on being paid for our services, and we try to make sure that happens one way or the other. But they just know that, and I can't tell a lot of difference in the recession. I can tell you that I don't know that. I went through the oil bust in the early 80s, and there was probably more adverse effect in the early 80s than there is now. I'm hesitant to say that.
I think you're probably right, especially for people who might rely on royalties,
right,
and need legal services. Phil Hurst is an attorney in Sulphur. Trey Gray is an attorney in Colgate. Kent and I are visiting with small town lawyers today on The Verdict. We'll be right back.
Most of the artwork that I produce is with colored pencil and watercolor. The subject matter that I use is, of course, Chickasaw. Most of my themes revolve around family and really that foundation that has been a part of Chickasaw life since ancient times. The Chickasaw Nation is a matriarchal society. You've got one lady, she's probably the oldest member of the family, that everybody goes to and that everybody reveres. That is something that every woman can look forward to in the Chickasaw Nation because they are extremely important in the family. Maybe one day I will be a matriarch. I think this is probably the secret to the success of our government, is that we still have maintained that idea that family is the most important thing and that we must minister to the family first, and then all other things will fall into place.
In Oklahoma, with the technology that's being developed every day, it would be difficult to get much better than it is now, but I anticipate that it will.
Technology is always going to improve. It's always going to get better, and as it does, these fields will give up more and more of their natural resources.
I think with technology and the way they're doing it, it'll be a good, clean, environmental place, and I'm blessed to be here.
The oil and gas industry runs deep in our history and gives us a sense that we have a really strong future ahead of us.
Welcome back to the set of The Verdict. Mick Cornett with Kent Myers, and we're talking today with small town lawyers. We talked briefly before we went out about the recession and how it might have affected you. Trey, have you seen the recession affect the level of clients that come into your office?
I have seen probably a decrease in the amount of cases coming in, but as far as it affecting the business, I think a lot of times, especially in the small town, we kind of live on our backlog, and so it hasn't prevented me from being busy, but I have seen a slowdown on the amount of stuff actually coming in.
Trey, let me stay with you and ask you a little different question that may be handled a little differently in a smaller community than a larger one. What do you do about when client A, that's a good client of yours, has a dispute with client B that's also a good client of yours in Colgate? How do you handle that? How do you juggle conflicts of interest?
Well, you know, one of the things that I did, and maybe historically is not done so much in a small town, I actually have a formal written client engagement letter that I have with every client, and it explains what I believe the ethics rule to say what a conflict of interest actually is, to kind of dispel the idea that you're somebody's general lawyer. I try to take it on for, you know, a specific case and a specific matter to do a specific thing, and you know, you're the expert on probably what a conflict actually is, but you know, I think what a lot of people actually think is a conflict of interest really isn't. So to some degree, it's a matter of kind of educating people on what a conflict actually is. But you know, a lot of people think if you've represented them before, then you can't represent somebody else in a case against them, and I don't think that, you know, that's really the status of what the ethics rule or the law actually is.
So you try to make it clear going in what the parameters are going to be.
Exactly.
Phil, what's your comment about that?
Well, I think it's very difficult to in my practice, very difficult to do that. You really get conflicts of interest in 2 or 3 areas. One of the primary areas, you get it in domestic relations. Yeah. You've represented both parties at various times. They either get married or they've been married, and then you have to, if one of them comes in, my attitude is you try to explain to them, like Trey, that they're retaining you as counsel is for an individual purpose, an individual specific case, and then you just go on and you just have to, you almost have to do it on the basis of who comes in first with the money, basically, and then you represent the one that does so, and that's just the way it is. You do get into situations. I've got into situations with domestic where you file for one and they go back together, and then you come in and then the other one comes back in. Now you've got a real issue about conflict in that kind of situation, and we have to deal with that in small towns. And strangely enough, that does happen.
Sometimes there can be a case that's just plain unpopular in town, and you may be drawn in and have an opportunity or an obligation to represent an unpopular cause. That could ruin a career in a small town, I'm thinking. How do you handle that ethically?
Ethically, my attitude is, people know me. That's number one. I've been there a long time. My attitude is that if they come in, I don't judge the cause or the basis for their lawsuit, nor do I judge the client. So I just, hey, if they want me to represent them, that's what I do. I don't feel that that's my job. I think in this country, every defendant or every client is entitled to representation, and they're entitled to good representation. And consequently, we have an obligation, ethical obligation, to give that defendant or that client the best representation we can get. And we don't, I don't care what the cause is, and that doesn't bother me in the least. If my clients are going to run from me at that point, then let them run.
Trey, do you have any comment on that question?
Well, you know, Phil and I we've actually talked about this a little bit before. And, you know, I have a friend who told me one time, he said, you know, if you're going to be a good lawyer, you're going to sometimes have to take an unpopular position. And that's part of being a good lawyer, is sometimes you have to take an unpopular position. And I think if you take that position in the proper way, and I rely on people sometimes like Phil Hurst and Kent Myers to kind of give me, you know, direction maybe on how to handle myself, because when you're young you want to be real aggressive, and I've had to learn kind of to back off that a little bit. But if you do it the right way, I think it can be done. It's just it's sometimes more important how you do something than what you're actually doing.
I've had enough matters over the years in smaller towns to know that there's a very different relationship in a small town that the local lawyers have with the judges and with the other lawyers in the town than may be true in Oklahoma City or Tulsa. What are the pluses and minuses, Phil, of the close personal relationship you'll have with the judges in Sulphur, or judges in Sulphur, and the lawyers?
Well, I would say from an ethical standpoint, being a lawyer is different than most professions, as you well know. If you're going to say that I can't be a friend with a judge or a friend with other lawyers that are practicing in the same town, then I need to get out of my profession because it's not one I want to stay in. In our profession, the judges are friends. We see them on a daily basis. The other lawyers are friends. We see them on a daily basis. There's only, I think, 10 lawyers in Murray County, or however many the number is. And so I don't have any problem with that. The judges, if they're good judges, they can be my friend and stab me in the back in a New York minute. So, they're going to rule in accordance with the law. That's what they're obligated to do. My job is to present my case as well as I can, and that doesn't mean I don't like them or I shouldn't be friends with them. I think that's just not the situation.
Trey?
I think a lot of times, especially we have this whole dynamic in Oklahoma. You have the tall building lawyers talking about lawyers from Oklahoma City and Tulsa, and then you have, the country lawyers. And I think a lot of times there's a perception that, there's a huge advantage. But I think Phil would probably agree with me. Sometimes I think one of the things is in a smaller community, to some degree, you're held to a higher standard. And the judges always have in the back of their mind that it's possible that if they're ruling for the local person, they're going to get accused of this favoritism. So sometimes it's actually a disadvantage for us because we actually have a higher hurdle to jump over for the judges sometimes, I think.
I think that's right, and I really think that one of the perceptions that comes out of Oklahoma City and Tulsa and the metropolitan areas is that anybody that would go to a small town as a lawyer is of somewhat less quality than the high-rise attorneys, and therefore they can treat us a little differently. And let me assure you that there's an awful lot of good country lawyers, an awful lot.
Well, how are the challenges going to change here over the next few years? There's an urbanization that's taking place around the world. How do you see the role of the small-town lawyer?
Well, I think it's changing. I think it will change. I think small towns will change. Mm-hmm. I think it's in the process probably. If you want to, relate it to what's going on in the world, and especially in our state, we've got way too many schools. Well, let's be realistic. Something's going to happen. We can't continue to support the number of schools we've got. I think small towns are going to change. Walmart changed small towns several years ago, and they've had to either adapt or they've fallen by the wayside. The practice in the small town, I think, will stay basically the same for a long period of time. People still need to be represented. They don't want to drive, in my town, they don't want to drive to Ardmore and then get a lawyer to come back to Sulphur to the county seat to practice a given case. And I think Trey would agree with that and say that they're just not going to do that for a long time.
Trey, what changes do you see coming?
Well, I think that's true, and I think it depends on the lawyer. If you go in Phil's office, he may be working on an attempted murder case, and he may have a stack of abstracts this high. That's not really necessarily me. I've taken a little different approach to it. I have specialized. One of the things I try to do is, I represent landowners all over the state, and then on a local level, I still do the probates and the divorces and things like that. So I think it's different for each individual, but I think probably one of the most important things is just being willing to change with the times.
Mm-hmm. Well put. Trey Gray, Phil Hurst, thank you both for coming on The Verdict. It's been a wonderful half hour learning more about doing business in small town America.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Kent and I'll have a final word when we get back.
All children deserve a life of hope and love, but sometimes they experience a life of pain, neglect, and abuse.
When that happens, each child deserves all the quality assistance and representation that can be offered in our legal system. For more information, call 23-CHILD.
Oklahoma Lawyers for Children, helping to bring hope and love back to the lives of abused children.
The
good life comes naturally to Tulsa, where nature's beauty is matched with an eye for aesthetics. A legacy of neighborhoods graced with lawns and landscaping and handsome homes. A place that seems to have patented an ideal lifestyle. Bank First is loyal to the quality of life Tulsa assures its citizens, to the priority placed on education, culture, and growth. Loyal to builders who transform raw land into residential charm. Developers who see opportunity and add vitality to Tulsa's economy. Bank First serves both enterprise and private lives that need a loyal partner. It's how we help nurture this city's very good life. Bank First. Loyal to Oklahoma. Loyal to you.
The Journal-Record is pleased to be a sponsor of The Verdict. The Journal-Record, since 1903, the best source of Oklahoma business news and legal information. And for almost 30 years, Oklahoma political, government, and business leaders have turned to the McCarville Report for accurate, reliable, inside information. Visit the McCarville Report online.
Welcome back to the set of The Verdict. Mick Cornett with Kent Myers. Glad you're with us here. We're wrapping up a show with Trey Gray and Phil Hurst, and they went through being a small-town lawyer.
Yes, they had options. They could have practiced, both of those guys could have practiced law anywhere in any city in the United States. They're that good. They could go to the high-rise buildings in New York City if they wanted to. They didn't. They wanted to practice in small-town Oklahoma. And frankly, small-town Oklahoma is well-served because of that.
And I thought it was interesting that one of them said they pretty much had to take cases as they came, and the other one said they were allowed to specialize a little bit, but just chose to live in a small town. So it takes all types, and it certainly is good to know that people throughout the state of Oklahoma have fine representation. I think that was certainly represented today on the show. Hey, I have a little bit of a website information. Trey Gray has a website that's there on your screen. And of course, you can go to our website, theverdict.tv, and tell us about a show or a guest you'd like to see right here on The Verdict. For Kent Myers, I'm Mick Cornett. We'll see you next time.
The preceding program was produced exclusively for the Cox Channel.